Welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week. This episode is going to be devoted primarily to Western North Carolina, ravaged by Hurricane Helene. Not the entire program, but most of it. I want to talk first in our focus on Western North Carolina with Chris Moody, who is a professor of journalism at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina. I've talked to Chris before on America Decides. He has written beautifully in The Atlantic magazine about the immediate aftermath of Helene, and I wanted to check in with Chris about what is happening now, what is improved, and what is yet to be accomplished. Chris, it's good to have you with us. Thanks for joining us.
Major, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
What can you tell my audience about where you are, what happened after Helene, and where things stand now?
I'm located in Boone, North Carolina, in the western part of the state, a very rural and mountainous part near the Blue Ridge Parkway, just about 60 miles north of Asheville. Asheville's a far more metropolitan area than we are, that was devastated by the storm. Where we are, a lot of people live remotely. They live on roads that, when the storm came, were not just ravaged, but completely destroyed. In front of my own home, there was a 30-foot gap in the road that just completely fell into the river, just absolutely destroyed on one side of the road. And the other side of the road was blocked by trees and downed power lines, leaving the people in our neighborhood just completely blocked off, unable to leave. But it wasn't long, and this was, I think, one of the most amazing parts of the aftermath of this storm. It was only moments when the rain let up that people started to come out of their homes with chainsaws, with shovels, with food, and with water. And people started not waiting for anyone to come and clean up their areas, but doing it themselves, not asking for permission. This is a part of the country that used to be known as the Lost Province. It was so remote and rural with rugged roads that it was cut off from large parts of the rest of the country. And people really built up an ability to take care of themselves. And that was certainly in practice in the aftermath of this storm. Now, of course, in the last couple of weeks, we have had relief from federal, state, and private people coming to help us. But it has been mixed by this sense of personal responsibility and a really go-gettedness and care for the people around us. It's really been quite a sight to see, Major.
And I will not use numbers, because by the time you hear the podcast, the numbers will inevitably change. Damage estimates, those unaccounted for, those tragically who lost their lives. But just describe in Boone what the immediate aftermath was in terms of those metrics. What was left in ruin? How many people do you know in your community who are either still unaccounted for or perhaps perished? What's the sort of immediate human toll that you observed?
Well, we know that there have been hundreds killed in this storm around for several states wide. In the last couple of weeks, we've seen numbers where in North Carolina there was right about 100 people still missing and not accounted for. And let me tell you, this is not for lack of trying. I mentioned that part of our road that fell into the river, creating a 30-foot chasm. That separated families that lived on either side. And every day, men and women were scrambling down into the river and climbing back up to visit their grandmother, their mother. And when I say visit, I mean not able to speak with them on the telephones. Our cell phone service was completely out. Our internet was out. And if you're like me and many of my neighbors, we still have landlines. Our landlines are still out for many of us. So even that one life hold that we had, the landline, thinking, oh, well, that'll always work when the power goes down, even those were out. So there was no way to check. So people were taking four-wheelers, side-by-sides, walking miles, I mean, 9, 10 miles on foot to bring food and water to their families. There has also been a lot of helicopter activity. There's an organization that is based in Boone called Samaritan's Purse. This is an international relief organization that is typically sends their workers all over the world, but it's based right here where the storm hit. And they have been working tirelessly to send people out to help people. They have been chartering Black Hawk helicopters and other types of air transportation to go into the really remote areas to find the unaccounted for and provide them immediately water and food, of course, but also Starlinks, hot meals, all kinds of support to places that to this day, Major, still are not reachable by road.
And what has happened in the last couple of weeks that is not, I don't want to overstate it, on the upswing, but indicates not just resilience, but small steps forward?
Well, my goodness, the narrative, as we say in the news business, has really shifted from a place that has been destroyed to a place that is being rebuilt. The level of volunteerism in this community has been astounding. I mentioned on the initial moments after the storm, people coming and doing whatever they can. And then the organizations started. This started both from the bottom up with just families helping each other out. We're talking roving bands of young men in trucks carrying chainsaws and shovels and water. And, usually you'd hear that term and you'd say, that doesn't sound so good. These people would show up unannounced and just come in and say, we're fixing what's wrong in your house. Very little permission asking, just the kind of people who are here looking to help. The churches here have been essential. Organizations, small churches and large churches alike, have been able to organize in ways that no other folks could on the ground, certainly. I mentioned earlier Samaritan's Purse. I got an updated set of numbers this week. They have had 24,000 people come and volunteer to help for this storm. 12,000 here in Boone alone. There's been 9,000 requests for families needing help from Samaritan's Purse, and they have helped many, many of those thousands. They've sent out 350 helicopters and for airdrops and for air support for people. Just an incredible enterprise. They were based out of a couple of locations. The one here is Alliance Church that was just a hub. Major, anywhere you went around town, there was always in front of businesses, in front of churches, stacks and stacks of bottles of water and food just for the taking. If you needed anything and could get to it, it was certainly there for you. People donated so much that places had to say, hey, we need to keep a couple of days just to look at what we have. And it could be even difficult to find places to drop off. That's how much giving has occurred in this community and people outside coming up.
Are there needs still that are yet to be met?
Oh my goodness, absolutely. There are the volunteer days continue every day. Samaritan's Purse does two jam-packed rooms full of new volunteers coming in for training. There are carpets that need to be pulled out there. One of the big problems with mudslides, Major, is it comes into your house, crashes through your wall, your windows, or your door, and your house is full of mud, sometimes 9-10 feet up. And the only thing that can get that out is the hands and feet of people coming with shovels to do it one by one, or with heavy machinery if it's really bad. People are going from house to house still. There are also, as I mentioned, people still without access to roads into town, which is, of course, how you would get your water and your food. So there's those airlifts still need to happen. Communication is still a problem. You might be out in a rural area and not be able to tell people that you have a need. That's why Starlink has been instrumental, and they've been dropping off Starlinks in these areas so members of the community can say, hey, we need more water, we need more food. This is ongoing. It's certainly not at the point where people on the roof of their house, yelling, help, help, help. But we are learning more and more what needs to be done. And the volunteers, even many weeks after this, just have not stopped. They keep pouring in from organizations, from the university where I teach, to churches. And then, of course, we should mention the federal response. FEMA has been here. They have an outpost here in Boone that they use to send out their teams, and they work through local channels as well. And they're dispatching their people to come to individual homes, check the damage, and get claims taken care of as soon as possible, from what I have seen.
When we come back, we'll talk to Chris Moody more about the federal response, the state coordination, local response, and other efforts to make things day by day a bit better in Western North Carolina after Hurricane Helene. I'm Major Garrett, segment 2 of the Takeout, coming your way in just one moment.
It was one of the first times I'd really seen what appeared to be a misinformation campaign happening about a community that I'm not only a part of, but I care very deeply about.
to Takeout. Chris Moody is our guest. He is a journalism professor, former reporter. He and I traveled the country during various previous presidential campaigns. He's a professor at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina. You can't give my audience a passing or failing grade for FEMA. I don't want you to do that, but evaluate what you have seen, what you've heard described about the federal response, pro and con, and try to help my audience understand what the ground truth is.
Well, I'll tell you a contrast that I have noticed. I was here when the storm hit, and in the aftermath of it, and I saw people taking care of one another, and I saw people coming from outside to help us, both state, local, federal. And then when our internet came back on, I checked the internet. And what I saw from what outsiders were saying about what was happening here versus what I saw on the ground couldn't be a wider gulf. I was actually shocked. It was one of the first times I'd really seen what appeared to be a misinformation campaign happening about a community that I'm not only a part of, but I care very deeply about. And it was really astounding to see the difference by what people were showing on their X feeds or on other social media versus what I was seeing in real life. Look, regarding FEMA and federal response, they always tell people in a disaster, prepare for maybe 3 days on your own, having enough food, water, and shelter if you can, because that's how long it takes to get things organized and to get things put together. And our location, I need to emphasize, is very difficult to reach if there are not roads. Rivers and creeks run through culverts beneath our roads that come off the mountains. We are in an extremely mountainous region, especially for being east of the Mississippi. And those roads were completely knocked out of commission. I mean, just crumbled into the river. You couldn't pass certain mountains. You couldn't get to certain places. It takes time to make that organization happen, especially in a difficult place like this. And so it really was no surprise that we didn't see an immediate response because people had to safely get up here. And that's what I was saying earlier, that people that were here were taking care of things in the meantime. Now, look, it didn't take very long for Samaritan's Purse to set up their outpost to serve people, and it didn't take very long for FEMA as well. A couple of weeks ago, I was at a neighbor's house who had a building that was just completely destroyed. A mudslide nearly killed his family, but they were all safe, thank the Lord. But it destroyed part of his home completely, and we had to clean that up. And while we were there, an agent from FEMA was there checking on the damage and was going to file a report. This was just a week and a half or so after the storm. So those boots are on the ground, so to speak, to help people. And I understand that it might be frustrating. Anything with a large bureaucracy, and I don't mean to speak, on behalf of the federal government. I know that they can be sometimes slow and lumbering, and I recognize that has been frustrating for people. But I would emphasize how strange it has been to be here on the ground and then see what outsiders say on social media and how different that really has been.
Can you give me a couple of examples of things said by outsiders that bear no resemblance to what you're witnessing?
Well, of course, there was the AI generated images that showed things that were just completely fake, just not actual human beings, say on a boat clutching a dog, and saying, oh, we got to help this poor girl. FEMA has abandoned her. She doesn't exist. Of course, she maybe this caricature represents a human suffering that is real. But all of this stuff about how, Major, to use the craziest stuff, like they can control the weather, whoever they is supposed to be, that they directed the storm to Western North Carolina, which has some Trump supporting areas. This is all nonsense. And we should know better. Adults should know better. And I know people get swept up in election seasons, but the idea that storm relief was withheld for some kind of political reason is absolutely nonsense. It has not been proved in any way, and I almost feel ridiculous talking about it, Major, just because it's so ridiculous. But I think it should be addressed that this is what outsiders were saying about our community while we were still digging mud out of our homes and visiting our aunts and our uncles and our grandmothers to make sure that they were safe. It was offensive, Major. I'm just going to say it. It was just completely offensive to see people using this community for political ends. And I certainly wish that they hadn't, but I understand how things operate these days. And I think it's important for people to keep a better focus, a clearer focus. The best thing you can do to support people here is to come help people dig out the muck We're open in Boone. Blowing Rock is open. Banner Elk, these areas, people can come. They can rent an Airbnb and look at the pretty leaves and come out and volunteer. You're going to get a much clearer perspective when you're shoveling out muck than when you're looking on X for AI generated images that are tricking you into thinking something that's not true.
Did that misinformation have any effect on the communities themselves? Meaning, did it create any divisions or confusion or rivalries?
I never saw anything like that. Of course, some people might have seen it and believed it, of course, and but that didn't stop them from putting on their boots and getting filthy out there and cleaning up their neighbor's house. Nobody was not going outside and volunteering with places like Samaritan's Purse or other churches and church organizations. People still have come out in the thousands. The other day, man, I saw a guy. He had Pennsylvania plates and he had a truck full of supplies, and he just came with no plan. He slept in his truck and he just showed up places to deliver food, and he was there, hands and feet ready to work. And we saw so many people come and do that. And I think they got a very clear idea of what is going on here, both in the devastation that was caused, but also in the intensity of the determination of people to rebuild.
So, one of the questions that has come up also is the ability of Western North Carolina to not only organize itself on a day to day basis, but organize itself sufficiently to participate in this presidential election. What have you seen in that sphere?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially, as a longtime political reporter, this was on my mind. Are people going to be able to vote? And the answer is yes, they will. I mean, I think realistically, there's going to be a little bit of a maybe fewer voters than there would have, just because people have a lot going on in their lives, and perhaps they just can't get out, and their life is already stressful as it is. So let's acknowledge that reality. Will it be enough to flip a state? Gosh, I can't say so. I think it'll be interesting to do an analysis after the election. But efforts are really being made to make sure people vote. We have early voting here in North Carolina. A couple of weeks, people can find a place. They have many locations that they can visit. And people are really going out. There's an organizing structure here to help people to make sure that they can vote, to know where they can vote. Will it lower the turnout? Maybe a little bit. But man, I think in an election like this, Major, when the stakes are so high, people are going to find a way to get out there one way or another. These are resilient people, and when they put their minds to something, they're going to do it. You better believe it.
And the State Board of Elections has made accommodations in Western North Carolina for precincts to move if people have to vote in a neighboring county simply because that's the only county they can actually access because roads don't currently work to hit the precinct that previously existed. Those accommodations have been made.
That's right. And also, voting absentee, and also we're a voter ID state, but there are options that you can have to sign an affidavit or to present your ID later on. Something might have been lost in a flood and you can't get the DMV, or the DMV is closed. And so people are being very conscientious. Election workers are all local workers and volunteers. It's something to remember about our system. And when you go to vote, you do see your neighbors giving you the ballot. They are people that we know. And so people are working very hard in a nonpartisan way to get people to vote. And then, of course, obviously the election, the campaigns are out and about trying to encourage people to vote. And you and I both know how determined election workers are in these last couple of weeks. It's GOTV time, get out the vote time, and people are going into these mountains. They are climbing the hills. They are on the ATVs doing that get out the work vote for both parties. And I do applaud them for participating in the democracy in that way.
Chris, 30 seconds left. What else do you want my audience to know about your community?
Well, I want you to know that that especially Boone and the surrounding area here is open to come and visit. You don't have to cancel your plans, but I would recommend that you at least take a day to pick up a shovel and come. There are so many volunteer opportunities. You'll have no problem finding a place to do a little bit of work, and you'll meet quite a few of really good people. I certainly have in this case. I've only lived here for 2 years, I should mention. I'm not a longtime resident, and I've never seen anything like this. And I've been through natural disasters before, and this is something special. So come on and see us. We appreciate you.
Something special indeed. Chris Moody, I appreciate your time very much and good luck with everything.
Thank you, Major.
Thanks so much. Segment 3 of the Takeout coming your way with another guest. Yet to be decided. No, we know who it is. I'll tell you who it is when we come back.
this is just, this is a remarkable turnout for as early as it is.
Welcome back to the Takeout. This is segment 3, and for those of you watching either on Paramount Plus or CBS News 24/7, you might detect a makeup and wardrobe change. Such as things happen sometimes. For those of you who are listening, you'll just have to imagine what all that looks like. I also, as I closed out segment 2, I said we didn't know who the guest. Well, we know who the guest for the rest of the show is going to be. David Becker, election law expert for CBS. And he has a title that I want him to give and describe what it is and what it means. But he is someone who, as you well know in this audience, co-wrote with me a book called The Big Truth, Upholding Democracy in the Age of the Big Lie. David is in Arizona, Phoenix to be exact, in the lobby of a very swanky hotel. David, good to see you.
Hey, good to see you too, Major. Thanks.
What's your title, and tell everyone what that organization does?
So I am the executive director and founder of the nonpartisan nonprofit Center for Election Innovation and Research based in Washington, D.C., electioninnovation.org. We work with election officials all over the country, as you well know, Major, Republicans and Democrats, and support elections that voters should trust and do trust, really work on issues of election integrity. And of course, a lot of the issues with regard to disinformation that have come up in the last several years, as we wrote about the lies that are still going on, that people like me are dealing with even as we speak today.
So let's talk about North Carolina. When we wrapped up or came close to wrapping up our conversation with Chris Moody, who was kind enough to join us from Boone, North Carolina, he described efforts being undertaken in Western North Carolina specifically to help people cast their ballots and participate even as they try to dig out, and that is a literal term, from the damage wrought by Hurricane Helene. How would you assess what's going on in Western North Carolina? Then we'll talk more broadly about the state in a second.
So I should first say I haven't been down there personally, but I have been talking to election officials in the state, as well as places like Georgia and Florida and South Carolina, which have also been hit pretty hard by the extreme weather events. What I'm hearing is incredibly inspiring, that actually early voting is going remarkably well, even in those western counties. Of the 80 early voting sites that were scheduled before the hurricane to open, and early voting's been going on for about a week now, 76 of them opened without any having to be moved or anything like that. I'm not hearing any problems of voters having trouble finding a site where they can cast a ballot. And we should remember that the election officials and even the voters who are taking part in democracy right now, the election officials who had to find sites, get them ready, make sure they had power, make sure they had cell service, make sure the equipment was ready to deploy. They, just like everyone else in Western California, were dealing with issues relating to their homes and their lives and their children not being in school and not having cell service and not having food and water and not having access to roads. And I've heard stories from the state election officials there of election workers who were putting their personal lives aside to go make sure that these election offices were going to be open, these voting sites were going to be operational. And we're likely to hit over 2 million ballots cast in North Carolina by this weekend, which is just, again, absolutely remarkable, a testament to the election officials and all to the voters who had the enthusiasm to show up.
And in North Carolina itself, that number, more than 2 million by the time a good portion of our audience hears that, what does that tell you about the early voting experience in North Carolina overall?
Yeah, North Carolina, like many other states, has a culture of early voting. Georgia is very similar, has a culture of early voting. But these numbers are particularly high. I think we should note that. Now, from a perspective of who's going to win the election or whether this is good news for Democrats or Republicans, there's no way to tell that whatsoever. We can't take anything from the sense that there's more early voting. We do think that there is likely more early voting amongst Republicans than we might have seen in 2020, because Republicans have tried to turn away from the disinformation about the security of early voting and mail voting and tried to encourage it more. In general, that's a good thing. I mean, we should hope that everyone who wants to vote has access to all of the convenient methods and secure methods to vote. But it tells us nothing about the outcome. It does tell us, though, likely I think we're on track for turnout that is pretty high, which is what I thought before. As you and I have talked about and written about before, 2020 was the largest turnout in American history by a large margin, 20 million more ballots than had ever been cast in any election in American history. It would be remarkable if 2024 met that. I don't know that it will, but I think at a minimum, it's likely to be close.
And by the time a good portion of our audience hears this conversation, David, we will, as a nation, be probably well over 25 million early votes. And just remind our audience, when they hear that term early vote, describe the kind of voting that is. Is it all mail? Is it early in person? Is it some hybrid combination of the two?
So when you hear people like me talking about early votes overall, you're talking about early in-person votes, votes that have been cast in an early voting center and given to election officials, and mail ballots received. So basically, these are all ballots that have actually been officially cast, received by election officials. They haven't been counted. They're not going to be reported out, of course, until the polls close, but they may be reviewed in the case of mail ballots and loaded up into tabulators, scanners, so that they can be reported quickly. Everyone wants quick election results, or at least as quickly as we can get them. So these are all ballots that have been cast. There are mail ballots out there that have been delivered to voters that have not been received by election officials. That's not included in this total yet. And of course, there are many, many days of early voting left. We're still well over a week before the close of voting on Tuesday, November 5th. So this is a remarkable turnout for as early as it is. And in some states, Georgia is over 2 million right now. By the weekend, it could go over 2.5 million. Georgia's a state that saw just over 5 million ballots cast in 2020. So they're close to 50% of their overall 2020 turnout with well over a week before Election Day. And we should also note, unlike 2020, when they had Senate races on the ballot, they don't have any other statewide race on the ballot other than the presidency. There's no Senate races on the ballot in Georgia this time. Governor, Attorney General, Secretary of State in Georgia were decided in 2022. So this is remarkable turnout for a state that really the headline is the presidential race, and that's largely it.
And as you talk to election officials nationwide, David, but particularly in the closely competitive states, are they assuming that the composition of the electorate, meaning not who votes, but how they vote, will differ from 2020? 2020, of course, was influenced, and that's putting it mildly, by adaptations and fears about exposure to COVID. So people chose to vote differently. I guess what I'm trying to drive at is, do they expect more people to vote of both parties day of, for example?
Yeah. So overall in 2020, we saw give or take around 60% of all voters vote early or by mail. And a lot of that was driven by mail, of course, as you just noted. The pandemic drove a lot of that. Every election official I've spoken to outside of the states that are essentially all mail, states like Colorado and Washington and Oregon and California, and states that are almost all mail, states like Nevada and Arizona, which have had a long history of mail voting. Most states where there's options to vote early in person by mail or on election day are expecting mail balloting to go down somewhat from its record high in 2020, but still pretty high. Probably, we might have seen around 40% of ballots cast by mail in 2020. That might go down to the 20-25% mark. Some states will be higher than others. I think in general, we'll see early in-person voting probably tick up a bit. Not a huge amount, but tick up a bit as more people want to vote early in person and vote in person and get that vote done around their community and see the workers in the polling places. And then I think we'll probably see an uptick in election day voting as well. And it just reflects the fact that voters know their choices and are choosing what's most convenient for them. And it might be that I think we're still going to see to some degree, because all of those ballots are counted and reported in different ways on election night and in the days following. Some particularly mail ballots that come in on election day, they can't really be counted or reported until usually Wednesday or Thursday at the earliest. But since we're going to see a reduction in that, I think we could see overall results, unofficial results, a little bit sooner than we did in 2020. In 2020, the media called the race for President Biden on Saturday at around 11:30 in the morning Eastern time. I think we'll see that sooner unless the margins are incredibly narrow, which of course no one can predict.
No one can predict that, but we are going to try in segment 4 to tease out what election night might look like as returns come in, because some states have changed their laws in preparation for this election. Some have new equipment, which could speed up some of the results. We'll talk about both those topics, plus much more, when we come back for segment 4 of the Takeout in just 1 second.
It has always taken all of the states, every single one of the states, days, if not weeks, to count all of the ballots. That's just true.
Welcome back to Takeout. David Becker is our special guest, CBS election law expert. David, describe what you expect to see as far as the states that we are most interested in, battleground states, closely contested states, and their ability to report results quickly on election night into Wednesday.
So there's some variation between the states. Something we should all remember first and foremost is that it has always taken all of the states, every single one of the states, days, if not weeks, to count all of the ballots. That's just true. And the reason we think it's been faster in the past is because the margins used to be much wider. So when the margins are wider, the media needs to see fewer of the returns in order to make a call that the winner was the winner. If we think about, for instance, California is likely to be called as soon as the polls close on election night because the margin is going to be so large. But the reality is California is going to have the vast majority of its ballots still to count at that moment. And that's totally normal. That's the way they do things. But that being said, there have been some improvements in some states, specifically Georgia and Michigan. Georgia and Michigan, I expect to report out faster than they have in the past. Michigan passed laws that allowed them to pre-process the mail ballots, for instance, which means a lot of those mail ballots, those arriving before Election Day, will be ready to go and to be ready to be reported very shortly after the polls close. Georgia has provided some additional resources to their local election officials to upload the information sooner so that it can be reported out sooner. So in general, what will happen in most of the states, before I get to the states that might take a little bit longer, is in most of the states, early in-person voting is going to be reported very quickly after the polls close, with the exception of Pennsylvania. I'll go into that in a second. In many states, the mail ballots that came in earlier, maybe arriving by the weekend before Election Day, those will be processed and be ready to report. Then in the hours after the polls close, the precincts are going to drive their returns into the counties, and the counties are going to report them up. That's going to take a few hours, but that'll still happen in the 2, 3, 4 hours after the polls close, and we should have most of those. But that leaves mail ballots that were returned late. It leaves military and overseas ballots that could arrive later. In states like Nevada, which allow for postmarked ballots to arrive a few days after Election Day, it leaves those ballots. And it leaves provisional ballots out, those ballots that might be questionable or they might need to make sure that the person didn't vote in some other way. In many cases, those ballots won't be dispositive, but in a lot of them, they will be. And so we're going to have to wait to see. But Georgia and Michigan, I think we're going to get most of those results out early. Arizona, I think it has really good laws and procedures, but they also have a culture of returning those mail ballots late, which means they return them on Election Day. And no matter how good your laws are, election officials can't process and count a ballot they don't have. So if they get it on Election Day, it's probably going to be into Wednesday, maybe even Thursday, depending on how many of those ballots there are. Nevada could see some similar issues. Nevada and Arizona vote very similarly, with the vast majority, about 85%, voting by mail. And then Pennsylvania is the big wild card. In Pennsylvania and in Wisconsin, election officials begged their legislatures. In Wisconsin, both houses controlled by Republicans. In Pennsylvania, it's the only state where there is a split legislature. There is one house controlled by Republicans, one by Democrats, to allow them to pre-process those mail ballots. And those legislators did not act. So they cannot process those mail ballots until the morning of Election Day. In Wisconsin, that probably won't be as much of an issue because they don't have that many mail ballots. Maybe 10% of their vote will be mail ballots. They should be able to get them, relatively reasonably, maybe by Wednesday. But in Pennsylvania, all of the early in-person and the mail voting are processed as mail ballots. They have to review the envelope. They have to confirm it comes from the right person before they separate the ballot from the envelope. They put it into a scanner and they tabulate it. And so Pennsylvania, as we recall, took until Saturday until there were enough ballots for them to call it for Biden. It's still going to take some time. That said, there is some good news. They in Pennsylvania, they have bought some new equipment, so things are going to go a lot faster. We should also note this is only the third federal general election in Pennsylvania history where they have offered mail voting to everybody. The first time was in 2020. So election officials and voters are getting a little more familiar with it. And then probably the biggest factor is we won't have COVID. And so they can have more workers in tighter spaces working closely together without worrying about getting sick. So what I'm hearing from election officials in Pennsylvania is give or take Thursday, they should have most of those ballots counted. So we might have to wait a few days. That's normal, particularly with close races, but that doesn't mean anything nefarious is going on. That's just a process that everyone knows going into this election.
So let's think about this on East Coast time, election night. It's midnight, East Coast time. Do you think by midnight, East Coast time, election night, we will have a pretty good read, maybe not a projection, but a pretty good read on Georgia, Michigan, North Carolina, and Wisconsin?
Maybe not Wisconsin. I think we might have a good read. That good read might be this is too close to call.
Right.
That
yes.
This is very, very narrow. Yes. I think we will see most of the ballots counted, the vast majority of ballots counted by that point in time. Look, if I were to make a prediction, I would say you and I almost certainly aren't going home at midnight having a presidential race called.
No, we will not. That's for sure.
But I think we'll have a pretty good sense. And that, like I said, that sense could be, oh, wow, this is really close in one or more of those states. And they're just going to need to count more ballots until we can see who won.
And what is the state, David, of pre-election litigation this election year?
This has been an odd year for pre-election litigation. What has happened pretty much every other year, including 2020 during COVID, was the parties kind of litigate rules out well in advance of the election that they know are there, that they want it, that they think will benefit them. And the only litigation that happens late is litigation that's necessary to clarify something that wasn't clarified. A good example of that is litigation, for instance, over some vague rules regarding mail voting in Pennsylvania, which was fairly new. And they were figuring out whether if someone left a date off the outside of their envelope, whether they should still count that ballot if it was received on election day. That's all legitimate litigation. You might not like the results one way or the other, but there's legitimate litigation. And even 2020, when there were adaptations to COVID, think more drop boxes, mailing more ballots out, things like that. I don't blame anyone for litigating it in advance and trying to get clarity from the courts that the courts say this is okay or this is not okay. These are the rules we're going to have on election day. What we're seeing in 2024 is something very different, though, with regard to most of the litigation. And it is litigation that has no chance of winning, that was brought way too late, that is based on very flimsy legal arguments and virtually no evidence. That seems designed more to fuel claims that an election was stolen post-election than to clarify the rules pre-election. Things like claiming the voter rolls aren't clean. The voter rolls are public. Both parties have all access to those voter rolls. They could have brought lawsuits many, many months or years ago to do whatever they needed. They didn't do that. Claims that the laws around military and overseas voting encourage fraud. This is totally false. But more importantly, these laws have been around in some cases for nearly 40 years. And they haven't been challenged. So
David, let me stop you right there because
yeah.
we have to wrap up the show, and I want to get people to pay attention to and join us for the Takeout Outtake Especial, where we will continue this conversation on litigation with David Becker. But for the main show, we'll see you next week, folks.
Election officials have learned from 2020 the physical sites are very secure, particularly in the large, sophisticated, highly resourced jurisdictions.
Welcome to the Takeout Outtake Especial, continuing our conversation with election law expert David Becker on this litigation. So is it harassing litigation mostly?
I would say it's not so much harassing because we're seeing every day courts smack this litigation down, right? I mean, it's the election officials are handling it. Just this week we've seen courts in Georgia, Michigan, North Carolina. In previous weeks, we've seen courts in Mississippi smack this litigation down. In many cases, these are Trump-appointed judges smacking this litigation down. So the courts are acting very well here. They're managing this as I think as these institutions should. What I'm really worried about is we're not going to see the full impact of this litigation until post-election. Particularly if Trump loses, and I think it's fair to say we're going to see all of these false claims revived, all of these claims that were rejected by courts and thrown against the wall once again to see what sticks in an effort to fuel disinformation and anger amongst his supporters. And one of the things I fear is potentially violence.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of that, in about the minute and a half we have left in the especial, what's the security environment around this election?
So the reality of election security is very high. I mean, election officials have learned from 2020. The physical sites are very secure, particularly in the large, sophisticated, highly resourced jurisdictions, Maricopa County, Atlanta, Detroit, et cetera. Election officials are taking their own personal security a lot more seriously. And so there's better security in that sense. There's more partnership with law enforcement. That being said, I think everyone is worried about the potential for organized activists fueled by disinformation to seek out vote counting centers and election officials and threaten or harass or dox them in the aftermath of the election. And of course, this isn't speculation, as you and I wrote about. This happened in 2020, and it continues to this day. It's still going on. And in some cases, we're going to see a lot of that fueled now by probably the thing I'm most worried about as a change from 2020, which is now a major social media platform is owned by Elon Musk, who has been the super spreader #1 of disinformation. And I expect him to help, Trump, if Trump loses, incite anger in the aftermath of the election by spreading some lies about the election.
On that sobering note, David Becker.
Always like to end on a high point with you, Major.
Thank you for your time. And thank you for listening and watching the Takeout Outtake Especial. We shall see you next week.